Good evening, and welcome to AARP's live conversation on fraud and scams. I am Christine Braccino, an AARP New Jersey volunteer and your moderator for this event. Earlier today, AARP hosted a webinar called Elder Financial Exploitation: Is This the Crime of the 21st Century? We were joined by nearly 200 participants from all over New Jersey. As a follow-up to that, we are going live right now with our special guest from that earlier webinar, Paul Greenwood, a retired San Diego Deputy District Attorney and nationally recognized fraud-fighting authority. Paul headed up the Elder Abuse Prosecution Unit at the San Diego District Attorney's Office for 22 years. In 1999, California Lawyer magazine named Paul as one of their top 20 lawyers of the year in recognition of his pioneering efforts to pursue justice on behalf of senior citizens. In 2018, Paul retired from the San Diego's DA's office to concentrate on sharing lessons learned from his elder abuse prosecutions with a wider audience. Later that year, he was given a Lifetime Achievement Award by his former office. Paul will address some of the most frequently asked questions from our webinar earlier today, as well as your questions tonight. If you have a question for Paul, please type it into the comments section, and we will do our best to get to it. Paul, thank you for joining us. We're looking forward to another great conversation about how to protect ourselves from financial exploitation.
Thank you, Christine. It's good to be with you.
Okay, let's get started. According to the National Council on Aging, approximately 1 in 10 Americans who are 60 and older has experienced some form of elder abuse. Paul, what is elder abuse and financial exploitation, and why may this be the crime of the 21st century? And are there different types of elder abuse and financial exploitation?
Well, yes, and one of the frustrating aspects when we talk about elder abuse is there is no common definition of that term in the United States. Every state has its own criminal laws. In fact, some states, such as New Jersey, don't actually define elder abuse in their criminal code. They may refer to victims as being vulnerable adults, which could be any age from 18 upwards. Where I prosecuted in California for 22 years, we actually have an elder statute defining an elder as anyone over the age of 65. So there is no universal understanding of what it means, other than that when some form of abuse occurs to an older adult or a vulnerable adult, then we term that in general terms as being elder abuse. Within that umbrella of the term, there are so many types of different conduct: physical abuse, slapping, pushing, hitting. There's physical neglect, typically by a caregiver has the responsibility for a due care towards the person that they are supposedly taking care of. There's also emotional or mental abuse. And then there's the sexual abuse of an elder, which is often so underreported. And then that whole area of financial exploitation. And when I look at the term elder financial exploitation, I just basically, when I talk to a jury, I would say it's a fancy term for saying that this guy, this defendant, ripped off this person who happens to be over the age of 65. Depending on the value or the loss of the theft, it can be either determined as a felony or a misdemeanor. And when you started out, Christine, you did say 1 in 10, which is reported. And sometimes I really wonder how we know that, because from my own experience, I believe that many more older adults are victimized. The problem is that so many of them never report it. So we don't really know in this country how many people are victims of elder financial exploitation, because so many are too embarrassed or too afraid to come forward and report it.
Well, who are the likely perpetrators of financial exploitation, and and who do they typically target? The senior citizens, or it could be anyone who can be, those perpetrators?
Well, I always tell people, victims of fraud or financial exploitation can be of any age. That's true. But it seems that the predominant target is somebody in their late 60s, early 70s. And the reason for that is that they are the people who have the money. They have accumulated some form of wealth over their lifetime. They've been very responsible. They've got their life savings. They've tucked money away for their retirement. They often live in a home that is free and clear of any mortgage. And so that person becomes the target of the predator. Now, who is the predator? Who is the perpetrator? Well, unfortunately, they take all different types.
Right.
During my career of prosecuting these kinds of cases, I have prosecuted sons, grandsons, daughters, nephews, nieces. I've also prosecuted lawyers, realtors. I've prosecuted a Methodist choir director. I've prosecuted the homeless transient. I've prosecuted the termite fumigator, the carpet cleaner. I mean, the bank teller. They come in all shapes and sizes. The problem is that when somebody from whatever background sees a likely target and the predator themselves is desperate for money, it becomes almost too easy to fall into temptation to steal from that victim.
From your career and all the experiences and cases that you've seen, is there one or two cases that you like to can share as an example of what happened in a financial exploitation or elder abuse?
Well, there are many. Obviously, the ones that seem to stick in the mind a lot more often are the very traumatic ones. As I had mentioned today in the webinar, unfortunately, several cases of elder financial exploitation that I prosecuted were cases also that ended up in the homicide of the actual elderly victim. And that is why, over the course of my career, I have been very aggressive in prosecuting any type of elder financial exploitation, even when the victim sometimes has been begging me not to do it. Because if we do not hold the perpetrator accountable at the first step of proving that they do rip off an elderly person, then they may go on to do other more serious, tragic deeds against that victim. So, for example, the last homicide that I prosecuted was of an elderly mother, 79 years of age, who dramatically went missing one day. The family were all very concerned, except one person, the daughter. She was a meth addict. And as we investigated the case and as it became apparent, she had indeed murdered her own mother and then dumped her mother's body in a ravine. And as we looked back at that case, we found by talking to the family that there had been a history of financial exploitation by this same daughter year in and year out in order to feed her drug addiction. And so it was a natural question, well, why didn't you report her to the police? And this is what the family told me. Mr. Greenwood, we tried to do that, but mother insisted that we do not report it. She wanted to help the daughter get free from the meth addiction. She thought she could do it without the involvement of law enforcement. She didn't want her daughter to be arrested for the drug addiction and for the theft of her jewelry. And unfortunately, that was the wrong decision. And ultimately, it ended up in her death. I have other similar stories like that. And so that's why I spend my time now warning people about indications of theft from an older adult, particularly if the perpetrator is a family member, because if we don't nip it in the bud now, it could either end up in financial ruin for the person, or worse, it could end up with their own death.
Well, you brought up the point that in that case, like the mother was hesitant was hesitant. She thought it might help her daughter. In that case, but if you're a family member or a friend and you're noticing things like that happening, is what can the family member or the friend do to bring that? In the webinar earlier today, you mentioned, I think the acronym was MDT. I think that was it. Apologies if I got it wrong, but was it like a team where you try to get together and work together to help?
Well, there's two aspects to that question. One is if you are a family member, friend, and you suspect that somebody is taking advantage financially of your relative or your friend, the worst thing that you can do is to stay silent. Even when the victim says, oh, I don't want anything to happen, I'm too embarrassed. No, first of all, we need to report it to our local county adult protective services. And unless you are a mandated reporter, you can remain anonymous. But it's so vital that adult protective services should hear about this so they can make their own independent analysis. They can talk to the victim, and then if necessary, they can cross-report that case to local law enforcement. Now, you did mention MDT. Yes, that stands for multidisciplinary team. And I really believe, Christine, that the most effective way of combating this escalating crime of elder financial exploitation is to involve the whole community. And how can you involve them? By getting them involved as volunteers in a multidisciplinary team approach, by coming to a meeting, by sitting alongside law enforcement, social services, bank folks, investment folks, and offering whatever skills that these volunteers can bring to the table. Maybe they're a CPA retired, maybe they're an auditor, maybe a psychologist retired, and all folks together can actually help. The only thing we ask is that they sign a confidentiality agreement so that the information that is shared in that meeting is never repeated outside of the meeting. But I'm absolutely convinced that if we are going to make a dent in this rising tide of elder financial exploitation, it has to be done with a local community working together.
Yeah, that's stuck in my mind from the earlier today. Whether you're a family member or friend, or the elderly person or senior person, what are the things that guidance you can give or advice in how to recognize or identify red flags as something is going on? In the case of the mother and the daughter, and the financial things, stealing of money, what are the things that go off and say, something's suspicious here?
Well, and I spend my time actually training, for example, bank tellers, what to look for red flags. For example, an elderly person walks into a bank, and this happened to my neighbor across the street 6 weeks ago. She walked into her local bank and asked to withdraw $23,000 in cash because she had been scammed by the Microsoft computer scam. She believed that her computer was being hijacked, and she went along with the scammer, believing that she needed to withdraw this money. Now, that to a bank teller should be a huge red flag. Unfortunately, it wasn't. They let my neighbor, 89 years of age, walk out in broad daylight with $23,000 in cash. So what I tell ordinary folks who are not bank tellers is look for any change in circumstances, in behavior, in routine. For example, if an elderly person comes to you and literally asks to borrow money from you in order to pay their utility bill, that is a huge red flag. I also remember one of my colleagues, his own mother was scammed, and he was a prosecutor. His mother was scammed under the grandma scam. And there were red flags that my colleague didn't identify. She was always somebody of the same kind of routine. She never drove out at night. But suddenly, in early December, she started driving at night, and he didn't know why. And so he asked her, and all she would say was, well, I'm out Christmas shopping. Well, she wasn't. She was out driving around, buying gift cards because she believed her own grandson, my friend's son, was in jail in South America. So changes in behavior, changes in certain patterns should be a red flag. And if your gut tells you that something is wrong, for example, if you see a new friend appearing on the doorstep of your neighbor, you see some work being done on your neighbor's roof, the worst thing we can do is not inquire. We need to be responsible. There's a difference between being nosy and being responsible. And I'm asking people to be a little more responsible and make some inquiries, because by doing that, you may actually save an elderly friend or neighbor from a heartache.
Yeah. That is all great information. And I just want to stop for 1 second to remind our viewers that if you have a question, please type your questions in the comments section, and then we'll go through and try to take those questions live. Paul, again, also in the early webinar, you went through some of the scams that are current out there right now. And during this pandemic, are there scams related to COVID that you would like to just, bring attention to and talk about a little bit?
Well, yes. I mean, one of the common ones right now is some of us have heard on the news about contact tracers, and those are legitimate. And we may get a call over the next week or so from a legitimate contact tracer saying, I regret to tell you, you've been in contact with somebody who's tested positive. And they will ask you for some limited information about your movements, but they won't be asking you about financial situations or your own personal Medicare situation. Whereas the bogus contact tracers, these are the perpetrators who spend their life looking for the next scam that they can target on somebody. They will pretend to be a contact tracer. They will pretend to be asking about your best interests, but in effect, they're asking you for information about yourself, which will enable them to steal your identity. So another one is emails that purport to come from the World Health Organization, asking you for information about yourself. People, unfortunately, today, we're all in fear in some respects about catching this dreaded virus. And anytime somebody tells us that we are in danger, we kind of panic. And that's what the predators want us to do. They want us to panic. They want us to respond immediately to anything online or anything on the phone. And that's how they get us. They catch us off guard, and they want us to reveal stuff about ourselves, which later on we will indeed regret. So I always tell people, don't ever give out information. Always take the name and the phone number. You can always get back to that person if they think they're a real contact tracer, and always consult somebody that you trust, another family member, a professional advisor. Even call your local police department if you feel that it's necessary. But don't just respond because somebody is asking you questions.
Right. Very good. Going back to financial exploitations, one of the things that was questions that came up this afternoon earlier was the question: how can consumers protect themselves from being overcharged for services? You gave an example about auto repair shops and other vendor contractors. Some tips or advice on things to ask before you engage them for work?
Certainly. Before you ever contract with anybody, do your homework. I am a great fan of Better Business Bureau. They have a tremendous database. So before you think about contracting, contact your Better Business Bureau in your area and say, do you know anything about this person? Have you received any complaints about this person? Every state has a contractors board. And so you can type in a name of a person. I would only encourage people to only contract with licensed, bonded contractors. because then you do have some form of recompense if something goes wrong. Only deal in writing. Always get a written, and always pay either by credit card or by check. Never, ever pay cash. And keep a record and keep a documentary photographic record of the project as it goes along. You know, I've had so many cases that I've prosecuted of dishonest contractors and leaving a job abandoned halfway through. They've taken all the money and they've disappeared. It's so much easier to prosecute that person when you've got a photographic documented evidence. But so often the victims are too embarrassed to come forward and get somebody else to finish the job. And so you don't have the proof sometimes that you need in order to show that this guy ripped them off.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, that was one of the things I learned at a conference where the New Jersey Division of Consumer Affairs spoke. And there is a database where you can check licensing of contractors. And actually, it was relevant to me at that time because I was engaging a contractor and I had to check. And thankfully, he was licensed. So good to know. Good to know. One of the other questions that came up on our webinar and also on our telephone town hall earlier this week, it was about advertisements that claim it is easy for someone to obtain an online copy of your house deed and steal your house. Paul, is it that easy to steal someone's house deed, or is this a scare tactic to sell product?
Well, this is a personal view based upon my 22 years of prosecuting. Yeah, there was a few times, just a very few times, when a house was stolen, but the person knew the suspect. I think this idea that we all need kind of protection by paying $10 a month so that to reassure us that if our house is stolen, then there's somebody who can help us. I really think that's a little exaggerated myself. Certainly, it's not for me at the top of my thoughts. And for anyone who has at least concern, there are a couple of things. In most states, you have to pay property taxes, and in California, get my bill from the state. If it doesn't come, I would certainly be thinking it wasn't coming. If anyone is the least concerned, there's another is can check with their own county recorder's office to make sure everything is still in their own name or in the name of their trust. So those are things that you can do proactively without having to spend extra money to get some kind of extra protection.
That's good to know. Yeah, I saw that question. It was kind of scary. This has been great. And we're going to take one last question before we close. And the question actually comes from Philip tonight. What can you do if someone steals a lot of money through some financial exploitation and disappears to another state, or just disappears because you don't know if they went to the state? But
sure. Well, obviously the first thing you do is you do file a report with your Adult Protective Services and with your local police department. And you must not let your police department wriggle out of it by saying, well, the suspect's in another state, so we ought to let the other state's jurisdiction deal with it. No, that's a cop-out. The crime occurred in your jurisdiction. And if you're the victim, you don't need to be chasing out to another state. And we have the power to extradite people from other states. We did that all the time. In fact, one of the examples I gave today in my webinar was of the crook who stole from a Catholic priest, and he ended up in South Carolina. We followed him, we identified him, and we extradited him back from South Carolina to San Diego and held him responsible for ripping off this priest of $41,000. So there are ways in which we can do it, and we can, as part of a multidisciplinary team, we can involve the feds, and they can then involve their counterparts in another state. So there are ways that we can do it, but it has to start local and hold your police department accountable to make sure that they follow through and investigate thoroughly.
This is all great information, Paul. And before we wrap up our Facebook Live conversation, any last closing thoughts that you'd like to share with our viewers?
Well, sadly, this subject, elder financial exploitation, is not going to go away. It's only going to get worse. We all have a duty to be on the lookout, not only for our own elderly parents, but for our neighbors down the street, for people that we spend time with when this pandemic is over. Mm-hmm. And the worst thing we can do is to say, it's none of my business. And that's why it's going to take a community to deal with this problem. And if you are a professional retired from a career, think about getting involved in your local elder abuse task force. And if you don't have one in your area, then maybe you are the person to start one and get the dialogue going between law enforcement, social services, financial institutions, and your local hospitals, because that's what it's going to take in order to combat these predators and make sure they are held accountable for their crimes.
Absolutely. Thank you again, Paul, for this informative discussion and for continuing to stay on top of all the latest financial exploitation scams. For our viewers, if you're concerned you've been scammed, you can reach a trained volunteer at the AARP Fraud Watch Network helpline at 877-908-3360. Again, that's 877-908-3360. If you like more information and resources on fraud and scams, please visit aarp.org/New Jersey Fights Fraud. Again, that's aarp.org/New Jersey Fights Fraud. If you'd like to receive emails about AARP New Jersey events, please go to aarp.org/yes, then the number 2, email New Jersey. That's aarp.org/yes, the number 2, email NJ. I'm sorry, NJ, not New Jersey, NJ at the end. Thank you again, Paul. This was great, and I always appreciate listening to your experience and advice. We hope you learned something new about how you can stay safe from fraud and scam. Thank you, and have a good evening.
Thank you, Christine, and thanks everybody, and thank you, AARP.